I'm a summer camp lifeguard, and someone wants me to drown the kids. The town of Spectral Lakes, Washington is known for the glut of ghost stories choking the annals of our history. You can't enter a single gift shop, motel, or museum without gaudy flyers advertising our ghost tours being shoved into your periphery on every kiosk. Most of the stories are relegated to Lake Spectral, the biggest of the town's lakes, but I've always felt a much deeper connection to Lullaby Lake, mostly because my Uncle Chung-ho, all names in the story changed for privacy, ran the summer camp there, and I lived near it for my whole childhood. But after my brother was born, Dad got a job in Seattle and we moved away for a while, only returning after I was 16. The small town now thoroughly bored me. Staying at home wasn't an option. Dad was always at work and Mom moved back to Korea. So, having nothing better to do, my brother Ken was like a little gnat hovering around my head, always asking me stupid questions or just generally invading my personal space. I needed a summer job, and the local haunted roller rink wasn't hiring. Uncle Chung-ho threw me a lifeline, though, offered to let me be a lifeguard for the late afternoon shift. Even let me stay in a cabin in the camp so I could be my own man. There were ghost stories about Lullaby, of course. Before I'd moved away, there were rumors floating around school about kids who walked into the lake to find lost toys and then, themselves, became lost. When thinking back on those stories at the time, I wondered if it was a way to warn kids about the dangers of the lake. Drowning deaths weren't uncommon in a lakeside town. The first few weeks of the job were easy. The kids who grow up around the lakes already know how to swim, so I only really had to worry about the visitors. A couple kids needed help sometimes. Nothing serious took place. A few fights over toys resulted in tears, and I had to break up violent water gun battles, but it was a chill experience overall. I even got to spend an almost intoxicating amount of time with the other lifeguard, Bethany, without my kid brother trying to butt in. She was another Spectral Lakes native. Once, when I was on duty, she hung out with me despite her shift being over. I kept fidgeting with my whistle as she talked and scarcely dared to look at her blue-green eyes. "You're lucky you started this year. Last year sucked bad," she said. She pulled at her black ponytail. I watched a couple kids try to climb up on the giant log bobbing against the rope marking off the safe swimming area. They managed to gain holding on the slippery surface before the log slowly rotated, sending the kids laughing and splashing to their doom. "What happened?" I asked. The whistle's lanyard was tight around my fingers. "A kid drowned. Snuck in after hours on a dare." She adjusted herself on the wood camp chair. The peeling paint stuck to the bottoms of her forearms. "The morning lifeguard found him. He quit after." "Oh!" My finger went white, its circulation cut off. I untangled it from the lanyard. Must have been awful to see. A few kids on the shore were trying to skip rocks, but kept throwing them way too close to the swimming area. I blew the whistle and got them to stop. "Yeah." He told me the kid must have died the night before, but something was really weird about the body. I took a tentative glance at her. Her eyes looked far off, past the pine trees on the other side of the lake. "What?" I asked. There were bruises around his ankles. Police said that his feet must have gotten tangled in debris. A mosquito buzzed near her thigh. She didn't seem to notice. But that lifeguard told me they looked more like hand marks. "Chung-ho never told me," I said, brows raised. She shrugged. "Didn't want to scare you off, Proly." She smiled at me. It was simple, almost put on in order to lighten the mood. But still, I glanced away from her, cheeks red. It was good that I did. I noticed something. A blur of orange lurked under the water, near the border rope. A few brown fingers showed their tips above the surface before sinking down. I jumped from the tower, grasping my rescue buoy and diving into the lake. The water was freezing. I shouldn't have focused on that in such a life-or-death moment, but I was used to the temperatures of Washington lakes, and this was unusually cold for a summer day. I grabbed at the orange blur before me, fingers closing in on swimsuit material. I got a grip around a small arm with my other hand and dragged it up to the surface. The kid emerged in a huff. I propped her up on the buoy and quickly towed her to land. She hacked up the water in her lungs, thankfully not having enough in there that she needed any more help with. The other kids stopped what they were doing and watched with mouths agape. "Mr. Choi? Is she okay?" asked a friend of hers. "Ha! Katie can't swim," jeered one of the asshole kids. Katie's red eyes bloomed with scared tears. "You okay?" I asked. "My Barbie's gone." I dropped her and tried to get her back. "She's gone forever," before a fresh batch of wails erupted from her. I looked down. Could have sworn her ankles looked red, too. But before I could get a better look, Bethany descended on her. Waves of comforting words coming from her lips as she put an arm round Katie's shoulder. "Do you want a Sonic popsicle? I got one in the freezer," offered Bethany. Katie wiped at her red eyes and gave a nod as she wheezed. I reported the incident to her parents and my uncle. After what felt like hours of my uncle and I calming down her hysterical mother over the phone, it was twilight on the lake. I went to my little cabin, which wasn't much more than a small bedroom and bath, and slipped out of my swim trunks. "Oh shit," I said as I put my lifeguard gear away. My whistle was missing. It was a cheap little thing, but Uncle Chung Ho was cheap about replacing stuff. I walked back out to the lake to comb the shore for it, but it was getting real dark and I figured I'd just find it in the morning. So I stopped. After dinner, I settled into bed and felt a wave of exhaustion overtake me. I got a text from Ken about how he ate tacos that day and liked them. For some reason, he kept using my dad's phone to update me on random things. Usually I'd play gacha games or something before I slept, but I could barely keep my eyes open, so I just let myself drift off. I felt cold water all around me. My eyes seemed frozen shut, so my body just floated in blackness for a while. I kicked my legs, hoping to get my head above water, but I had no idea where I was going, and there was something wet and slimy curled around my ankle. I screamed in surprise. Even after kicking vigorously, it just stayed firmly in place, as if it had been tied there to anchor me to the lake bed. Lake bed. That was it. It must be a lake plant, and if it was growing from the bed. So the opposite direction would be my ticket out of the water. I tried to calm myself and bend down to pull away the weeds, but knew my breath wasn't going to last much longer. My heartbeat thumped in my ears. The rubbery weed was tough to tear through, and my fingers refused to bend right in the cold. I kept trying to force my eyes to open, but they wouldn't. The darkness grew more oppressive as air leaked from my lungs. I felt around for the body of the weed and pulled myself down it like a reverse climbing rope. The sandy lake bed was under my fingertips. My nails dug into the roots, grains getting stuck under them. I tried planting my feet on the sand and pulling it out, but nothing seemed to work. Things were getting desperate now. The more effort I used, the more breath left my body. The water around me started to feel like a vice pushing and crushing me inward even as my nerves numbed. My joints started to refuse my brain's orders. I grew listless, consciousness fading. I began to feel impossible things in my last moments. I thought I could smell my mom's cooking, but it was just water pouring into my nose. I heard her laugh, but it was just bubbles rushing into my ears and bloodstream. In the still waves, my limp body floated for minutes. I thought I was dead, but I still heard a weak heartbeat through it all. Every pulse of blood in my limbs felt like a needle jamming life into a block of ice. Something touched me. It was almost like hair, or one of those sheer fabrics that people use to wrap bouquets. The thing gently washed across my shin, then again at my feet. Then it was gone, and I heard my whistle. I knew it was my whistle because my brother had banged it up and it never sounded quite right after that. But there it was, its sound echoing through the water. And that sound, somehow, got me to move. I could move. It was impossible, but I could, despite my body being weighed down by the lake's water that now filled it. The weed relaxed, freeing my leg. And next, I finally could open my eyes. It was still extremely dark, but I could make out some of what was around me. I saw the awful weed that had trapped me here. I saw the lake bed scattered with plant life and litter. And at my feet was the most surprising thing. The toy Katie had lost. It was a Barbie doll with a fabric mermaid tail. The fins must have been what brushed me earlier. Her painted face looked up at me, smile wide but eyes sad, like she missed her owner. I picked her up. Despite the exceptionally more serious situation I was currently in, I somehow felt like I needed to return her to Katie. She didn't want to be here. The whistle screamed again. I turned my head to face the sound. Came from deeper in the lake. The lake bed curved downward into a darker valley. I decided to follow the whistle. My lungs were full of water, and my feet walked on the lake bed like I was a spaceman on the surface of Mars. So clearly this was a dream. Why should I worry about getting to the surface now? May as well see where this goes. I tread through the ice-cold environment. The valley went deeper and deeper, through areas the moonlight struggled to pierce. Still, I wandered, guided by that eerie sound. To the left, I saw an old toy diving ring. To my right, a sunk fishing dinghy. I stepped on a broken bottle as I walked, cursing to myself. My words were garbled as bubbles erupted from my mouth. A trail of blood floated up from my heel. Still, I kept walking. Soon it was too dark to see. I stopped then. The full brunt of what was happening here was at the edge of crashing down on my psyche. A light was visible in the distance, cold and blue. I walked toward it. I heard the whistle again. It was followed by a choir of whispering laughs. Dark shapes were outlined in the light. Man-made structures. I couldn't make them out yet. The Barbie in my hand hadn't changed expression. It was a doll, I told myself. But somehow she looked scared. It's stupid to admit, but I hugged her close to give myself even an ounce of comfort as that blue light grew brighter. Amongst those dark shapes, I thought I saw something white moving, flitting from one shape to the other. I strained my eyes to see more, but my sight, despite the light getting brighter, was blurring more and more. The feeling of drowning began to overtake me again. I clutched the doll as I bent forward. I coughed violently, as if trying to hack the whole lake out of my lungs. Darkness pressed in on my vision. The whistle's cry cut off prematurely. The last thing I saw before blackness overtook me was a white face highlighted in blue. I woke up with a lot more coughing. Felt like it took a half hour before I could properly breathe again. My bed was soaked, like I'd sweated out all the soda I drank yesterday. When I got the chance to look up, I noticed my door was unlocked. I quickly locked it and stumbled to the bathroom. What a terrible night. I shoved my bedsheets into a bag. They really needed to be washed. I walked out of my cabin and headed for the laundry. The lake was as beautiful as ever in the morning light, but I felt a sudden aversion when looking at it that I'd never experienced before. Yawning, I continued down the shoreline in my sandals, which I could hardly feel with how numb my feet were, when a speck of hot pink caught my eye. A mermaid Barbie perched on the sand. Water lapped up at her fins. She smiled. Her stiff plastic arms pointed up at the sky, and beside her, almost dissolved amongst the sand, were bloody footprints leading out of the water. I looked down at my foot. Blood had pooled at the bottom of my sandal. I didn't want to go to my shift that day. I used the first aid station to patch up my cut foot, but I kept shivering whenever I caught even a glimpse of the lake now. Of course, I didn't tell Uncle Chung Ho the real reason I didn't want to do it. I just blamed it on my injury. "Well, you can still walk, can't you?" he said to me while I nervously stood in his office. "You can use your eyes? You can swim." He gave me a look. I shrugged. "I could have used that cabin of yours to store more tubes. Now I gotta keep them in the cafe. You know how hard it is for me to make coffee when there's 50 giant rubber inflatable donuts in there. You said that kids don't want coffee anyway, so the cafe's only needed for the adult camp season." "Yeah. And who in here's an adult?" He gave me another look as he pointedly unscrewed the lid of his thermos and took a long gulp of decaf. He wiped his chin and raised his brows. The least you can do for me is do your job with a little cut on your foot. Yeah? My eyes fixed themselves on the patchy carpet before I dared to speak the next words. But, hazard pay would be nice. Chung-ho glared at me with the concentrated power only an uncle could. Noah, remember what happened right before you moved away? I shrugged, trying to figure out where this was going. The fancy playground I just bought went missing. The whole thing. I got it with a loan I'm still trying to pay off. Now you want to get paid? You don't want me to go bankrupt, do you? I shrugged again, regretting saying anything about getting paid. The memory of that incident came back to me now. On reflection, it was really weird. The whole playground was stolen, the only bits remaining being some leftover screws and wagon wheel tracks that went straight into the lake. Police said there was only evidence of a singular thief, and that he'd worked through the night disassembling it and bringing the pieces onto a boat. No, Uncle Chung-ho, I don't want that. I was just joking. Jokes should be funny, Noah. I walked out of his office, wincing even as I stepped lightly. Already feeling sufficiently emasculated by the way I'd hugged that doll last night, I was desperate to hide my trembling when I took over Bethany's shift later that day. I failed. You all right, Noah? She asked, looking me up and down after she'd descended the Lifeguard tower. It's kind of cold today, huh? I responded, pressing my shivering hands to my sides. Not really. Bethany unwrapped a fresh popsicle, which was already dripping. Princess Seafoam. A sudden squeal mercifully ended the conversation. Katie spotted the Barbie poking out of my tote and immediately gave the doll what would have been a bone-breaking hug if it had been alive. Yeah. I found it on the beach this morning, I said, shifting my weight away from my cut foot. Thank you, said Katie, who jumped up and down. She wore her campground clothes, not her swimsuit. Probably not in the mood to get into lullaby. I sympathized. If you hadn't saved her, she was going to get taken by the weeds, Katie said, shaking her head and petting the doll's hair. Weeds? I wondered, heart thumping. What do you mean? Lullaby weeds take toys down deep, she said matter-of-factly. Maybe the lake likes to play with them. I dunno. Before I could ask anything else, she ran off towards her cabin. Good on ya. That mermaid coulda drowned, Bethany said. My shivers ceased as I looked at her warm smile. I climbed up the Lifeguard tower with a salute. There were a lot of kids out today. Coupled with the fear from last night's dream, it made the job much more stressful than usual. My whistle being gone, I almost lost my voice from yelling so much. My eyes kept darting from kid to kid, trying to make sure every head dipped underwater for a normal amount of time. Bethany decided to stay with me again. I liked the company, but when she talked with me or tried to show me some videos on her phone, I kept my eyes on the water. There was even a moment when she reached up and tugged on my trunks to get my attention, then offered me a Powerpuff Girls popsicle. I just smiled and accepted it without turning my head. It took all my strength to keep this up, but I couldn't let myself get distracted. Whenever I glanced away from the swimmers, my thoughts flashed back to the feeling of water surging up my nostrils and the heaviness that came with waterlogged lungs. I imagined finding the bodies of children floating up to the surface. Shit, there. A kid way out was bobbing his head out of the water silently, barely able to gasp as he desperately whirled his arms. Bethany immediately followed my gaze and leapt to her feet. Before I could move, she said, I got this. You played the hero yesterday. She grabbed my rescue buoy and made a graceful dive into the water. I called everyone out of the lake. A mass of kids gave disappointed signs and made their way to the shore. In the span of several tense seconds, Bethany swam over to the drowning kid. But before she could reach him, he sank under the water and didn't come back up. Bethany saw him go down and took a deep breath, following after him. Seconds passed. And then more. Then more. Something was wrong. I jumped forward, but somehow my trunks had caught fast on a nail head. My body lurched down, the threads broke, and I painfully landed at the base of the Lifeguard tower. My shoulder ached. For a second I wondered if it was dislocated. I spat sand out of my mouth and stumbled to my feet before managing a beeline towards the water. My shoulder crying in protest, I swam as fast as I could to the spot both of them had disappeared. Just before I went down, Bethany breached the water, gasping and sputtering. Her face was awash in fear. "I can't find him." I pulled goggles over my eyes and dove. Terror sunk its claws into me as the water overtook my head. I tried my best to push it all away as I frantically searched for the boy. He'd been wearing black swim trunks, which were frustratingly hard to spot in a lake. I went deeper until I found the silta bottom. There, in the weeds, a pale face shone between the green strands. Small bubbles of air burbled from its open mouth. Its lips were blue, muscles aching for air. I tore through the weeds until the boy's small body was free. Propping him under my arm, I propelled myself off of the lakebed and shot towards the surface. The next few minutes were some of the worst of my life. Bethany called for Uncle Chung-ho and the ambulance. While we waited for help, it was up to us to get this kid breathing again. We'd screamed at the kids on the shore to go back to their cabins, but they didn't move, just staring in horror at their friend's blue skin. CPR training forced itself to the front of my mind. All of my energy went into compressions. I didn't want to break the kid's sternum, but the water just wasn't coming out. I sang to myself, using it to keep time on the compressions while calming my own heart from stopping. Every second felt agonizing. His eyes didn't move under his lids. This was my fault. I hadn't been paying enough attention. I was so overtaken by fear that I almost didn't notice when he started coughing. The kid retched out dirty lake water, turning on his side as bile burst from his throat and onto the warm dirt. Seeing the color return to his face, I started to cry. My uncle congratulated me warmly. He was proud I'd saved another kid's life. I felt cold. 2 close calls in a row was too many. Bethany didn't talk much after the kid was handed over to EMTs. I could tell she was in a shock. Probably felt horrible that she had almost let him drown. She went home looking pale. As I got back into my cabin's bed, the sheets now clean and dry, I rubbed my sore shoulder while I waited for the pain meds to kick in. I wondered if it was possible for me to sleep after all that had happened. I slipped out of bed to make sure my door was locked. I stood there for a moment, looked out my windows at the lake. I closed the blinds. My phone buzzed. "Wow, I'm playing Mario now. He's cool. I like the turtles, Ken. How much access did Dad let this kid have to his phone? Anyway, the rest of my messages were filled with notifications for new events in my gacha games. So I tried to get my mind off of things by playing them a bit. But while my character rode around in search of PNGs to gamble for, I soon slipped out of consciousness, the relaxing music taking me deep into the fathoms below. That blue light again. I saw it before me. I was back under the waves, toes dug into the sand of the lakebed, standing right where I drifted off the night before. The sudden feeling of water seeping through every nook and cranny of my being flooded my senses. I shuddered, which caused ripples of water to disturb the sand, pushing it back in gentle eddies. The whistle sounded again, much closer. The blue light and blackened shapes beckoned. So I walked towards them, one plodding step at a time. And then, the shapes finally crystallized into identifiable architecture. This was a little town. Well, not an actual sunken town. I'd seen pictures of those on the internet before, and they were a lot bigger than this, made up of normal buildings. This was something different. It almost looked like it had been built here, under the water, not flooded. There were several small buildings, some with doorways barely taller than my legs, and all of them were ramshackle, structures made of driftwood hammered together with clumsy hands. The biggest buildings, if you could call them that, were made from the hulls of upside-down boats. A few were modern speedboats and the like, but a lot were much older, like an 1800s logging raft, or a fishing dinghy. Doorways were carved out of them, and they were all decorated in some form or fashion. One little hut had tiny shells stuck around the doorframe, smooth large stones made for tiny pathways between houses. Another structure was lined with fishing nets braided into curious patterns. The bones of various fish stuck out of a boat's hull like a gruesome mohawk. Some of these buildings had large, misshapen balloon-like things tied to them, which floated a distance from the light so I couldn't make out exactly what they were. Lost toys were placed around as if this was their home. An old porcelain doll covered in lake moss stood at a shop counter as if she was preparing to sell her wares. Her hair floated in a cloud around her, but the lack of a current made it as still as a picture. I saw plastic construction toys near one hut. Broken G.I. Joes stuck in the sand like a battalion ready to shoot me. A chipped tea set with a lake crab curled under a teacup. The source of the blue light was a large old fisherman's lantern, the kind that'd be used to ward sailors from the lakeshore at night. It illuminated the centerpiece of the little town. A playground. This was the only piece that wasn't makeshift. It was a whole Costo playground with a slide and everything that was somehow sunk in the middle of the lake. This was Uncle Chung Ho's. I started when I realized that someone was inside it. Tiny white hands gripped the bars. I couldn't identify the face of their owner. It was wreathed in darkness. A pink beaded bracelet circled one wrist. My heartbeat was in my ears. Water clogged my throat. I tried to speak. No bubbles came forth this time. There wasn't any air left in my lungs to produce them. "Who are?" I managed, but I sounded too garbled to be anywhere understandable. The hands moved. Slowly, they uncurled from the playground bars and slunk back into the gloom. Then, with a kind of unsteady, waving motion, one hand appeared again under the blue light. It held my whistle. I breathed lake water in and out. Each breath was longer and more painful than any on land. I stepped closer to the hand, though every nerve told me to run away. Where would I run to? This was a dream. It had to be. I needed to find out who was haunting it. My fingers touched the ice-cold metal of the whistle. The hand didn't move. I couldn't pull the whistle from its frozen fingers. And the closer I looked at them, the more I could see that they were swollen. The hand pulled itself closer to its body. I was moved with it. A face appeared in the gloom, motes of silt floating about the dead skin. All I could do was watch while bloated, misshapen lips pulled themselves over small teeth as a whispering girl's voice pried itself in the folds of my brain. "Stop saving them." I awoke at the edge of the lake. It was just before dawn. The lake was completely quiet. I stood there for a moment, in shock, watching the water crawl up to touch my feet, as if beckoning me back down with it. Up and back, up, and, in the early morning light, it was hard to discern anything. But I started to see little shapes in the waves, gently swaying with the tide, bobbing up and pulling me back. They looked like children's fingers. I staggered back from the shoreline as the full brunt of everything I'd been through hit me. I threw up silty water, my stomach's contents making a mess of the beach chairs beside my cabin. "Son of a bitch," I said between retches. All the water was finally out of my body, but I still felt the slimy pond algae mucking up my throat and nose. I retreated into my cabin and drank a few cans of soda to try and wash it down, then gargled a bottle of mouthwash. I showered and scrubbed every last part of myself I could find. I still felt nasty inside. I sensed silt inside the crannies of my bloodstream, sand in between the joints of my bones. It was like the lake itself had infected me totally. I sat in the corner of my room next to my heater, my blanket pulled over my shivering body. Nothing warmed me up. The hands of the clock ticked by. Lunchtime was coming soon. The first group would be heading to the lake for free time after they ate, where Bethany would watch them. I thought of the whispered words I'd heard last night and burst out of my cabin, heading for my uncle's office. It took several lies to get him to shut down swimming that day. I insisted I'd seen teenagers sneak onto the property and throw used needles onto the beach. I also reasoned it was a good idea to keep the kids out of the water for now, out of respect for the incidents yesterday. My uncle agreed and announced the news over the PA system to the disappointment of the kids. He was impressed with my maturity, he said. I didn't feel noble, just scared. Uncle told me he'd ask the janitors to take care of things when they came tonight. Didn't know what I'd say to him when they didn't find anything. How would I keep this up for even a few more days? Would I have to pollute the lake myself? I said my goodbyes and started back to my cabin. On the way, I saw Bethany walk away from the lake dressed in her lifeguard swimsuit and a pair of sweatpants. I caught her eye and she sidled up to me. Bummer about the lake. We're still gonna get paid, right? She asked. You are. I get paid with food and shelter. Is that legal? According to Choi family law. She chuckled, but I could tell her heart wasn't in it. She looked distracted. By the way, since you're not doing anything right now. I stood up straight, my fingers tangling up with one another. Could you do something for me? What? I need to restock the popsicle freezer. Your uncle doesn't want to bother with it right now. But you've seen how much the kids like it. I mean, a dessert freezer right by the lake? It's just so perfect, right, Noah? I gave a half smile. Is this request really for the kids? Or just you? Come on. I'll pay you back. She grinned. Chung-ho wants me to stay on site even if I'm not working. I didn't have a reason to stay at the camp anyway. The kids wouldn't be swimming. Plus, getting away from it felt like a good idea if only to try and stay sane. No excuses, I suppose. All right, I'll be back later. Bethany beamed. Cool. And make sure to get SpongeBob ones. Aye aye, Captain. I didn't have a car, but Spectral Lakes was small, so walking wasn't a challenge. But my foot still ached, and it took about a half hour to get to the nearest crummy corner store. I leisurely scanned the shelves looking for ugly cartoon popsicles. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I took it out and glanced at the screen. See you soon, Ken. My head tilted in confusion. What did he mean? I didn't remember plans for him to come to the camp today. Might have been a mistake. Or an old text that finally went through. I picked out a bunch of popsicles and swept them into my basket. I then was faced with the dilemma of how I was going to keep them from melting in the long walk back. I added a bundle of ice to the order. Then a cooler. Then despaired at the state of my finances. That's when another text came. You are not here, sad face, oh well. Beth is watching me, Ken. Okay, so that first text wasn't a mistake. Something about this made me start to feel nervous. My brother was at camp being watched specifically by a lifeguard, not one of the counselors. I didn't like the sound of that. Did my dad drop him off with my uncle? If so, he wouldn't be swimming today, right? Even if Bethany was watching him, she knew the lake was closed. She wouldn't break the rules. I tried to shake off my anxiety, but it wouldn't go. The shivering feeling from yesterday started again. I had to go back. Now, I left my filled-up basket at the door to the chagrin of the shopkeeper and ran down the road towards the camp. Why was it so far away? As I sprinted, the cut on my foot opened up again. My footsteps trailed blood as I went, but I didn't care. My panic was rising and drowning out every other feeling. One car stopped when it saw me and a concerned woman poked her head out the window, asking if I was okay. I managed to convince her to drive me to the camp, insisting it was an emergency. She nodded, shocked, and we drove the remaining 5 minutes. She asked if she needed to call 911, but I told her it was a family matter. I made a beeline for the lakeside. My head swiveled around like an owl as I tried to find Ken. I didn't see him or Bethany anywhere. My trembling fingers tried to type on my phone. Ken, where are you? My dad texted back. I dropped him off with your friend Bethany. They're going for a swim. My heart dropped. I looked out on the water. The swimming area was empty, save for a single toy floating on the surface. Ken's boat. I waded into the water. This was something I'd done the past few nights, even if I hadn't been conscious of it. I knew where Ken was. I had to go get him. My fingers pierced the water as I dove. I went deeper and deeper, pressure popping my ears. The lake that was inside me felt like it responded to being back in the water. Currents carried me to the lake bed. Air bubbled out of me. The lake took over, and darkness encompassed my mind. I stood where I'd appeared last night, a good distance away from the underwater town. The blue light remained there like a star in the deep lake. I charged forward through the muck, my steps disturbing the silt and flinging it up into the stillness. I thought I could hear something in the town ahead. A choir of whispers. A giggle. My muscles strained against the pressure as I urged them to go faster. I almost stepped on that broken bottle again. Biting my lip, I picked it up and hid it behind my back. As the forms of the little buildings finally came into focus, I saw something that made my blood run even colder. In front of the sunken playground was Bethany. She had a smile on her face and sat cross-legged on the lakebed. A teacup touched her lips as she mimed drinking from it. Her eyes looked almost glazed over. It was horrifying. But the thing she played with was even more so. Across from Bethany sat the corpse of a little girl. It was wrapped in lake weed, which drifted about her swollen white face like tendrils of living hair. Her eyes were gone, picked clean by lake scavengers. Flesh sloughed off of her body like smeared dough. What was left of her mouth pulled into a mockery of a smile. A giggle traveled through the water as her adipocere-laced hands poured tea into Bethany's cup. "Where's Ken?" I screamed at the two of them as best I could. Somehow my words carried in the water, despite my empty lungs. It almost felt like the lake itself carried my intention. Bethany and the corpses' heads turned to face me, wreathed in cold blue light. "He's not ready to play yet," Bethany said. She stood up and placed herself in front of the corpse protectively. "Bethany, what are you doing?" She was quiet. "I need my brother. Where is he?" I yelled. Bethany's ponytail spread out around her head in the gloom. It almost looked like a dark halo. "My sister is lonely," she said simply. For the first time, I noticed, even through the layers of decomposition, that her and the corpse shared several traits. The black hair, the sharp brows, and matching beaded bracelets. "How long has she been down here?" I whispered. The corpse's vacant eye sockets stared at me. "We're twins," was all Bethany said. I thought I could feel tears on my face, but the only indication of their existence was a bit of salt in the thousands of gallons of fresh water around me. "Please, where's Ken?" I begged. "He's staying. He doesn't want to leave. It's nice here." Bethany's face was still. "Why don't you stay and keep her company?" I yelled. "Keep my brother out of it." Bethany didn't answer. Instead, the piercing whisper of the corpse's words dug into my brain. "She brings me new friends." The sentence sent a violent shiver down my spine. In the shadowy doorways of the huts, I glimpsed the wavering, twisting forms of other small bodies. Watching me, there was a boy with weeds tangling his feet. He carried the handles of a jump rope. A girl with a fish darting between her empty ribs slowly pushed a toy car back and forth. The balloons I thought I'd seen last night weren't that at all. The bodies of more children were there, floating upside down with weeds around their necks like a hanging scene from the lake's reflection. They drifted in the water, whispered to one another, used the weed to pull themselves downward to the lakebed like I'd done the first night I'd been drowned. They moved silently, all drawing closer to me while hugging toys desperately to their chests, as if those were the last bits of humanity left to them. The freshest body was a boy with a campground wristband on his arm. I couldn't move, or even think. That's when I heard a whistle blow. I looked around for the source of the noise. It came from the largest hut, made from the hull of a wooden boat. I moved past Bethany, who grabbed my wrist and pulled me to face her. "It's too late," she said. "Go home, Noah. I like you." Her pale face moved closer to mine. Cold fingers touched my chin. Numb lips closed over my own. I wrenched out of her grasp, squeezing so hard on her wrist that I heard a crack resound in the darkness. She cried out and fell to her knees. I didn't look back, charging into the large hut and gasping at the sight within. Ken lay on a bed of weeds. He was still, eyes bleary, but I could see a whistle tucked between his teeth. I hovered over him, my face twisted in pain, looking for any sign of life. In the perfect stillness of the lake bottom, there were only two things I could hear: my own heartbeat and Ken's. I hugged him, then propped him up against my side and swam out of the boat. Tens of dead eyes watched us. I quickly swam up, kicking my legs as fast as they would go. Hundreds of little fingers closed in around my vision. I swam harder and harder. The water filling me weighed me down, but my heart gave life, if even a little, and I just outpaced the corpses. That's when I felt the weeds begin to wrap themselves around us. The girl's whisper slunk into my thoughts. "Please don't go." I wielded the broken bottle like a hunted cat swipes its claws. The glass tore away at the weeds one after the other. In my desperation, I cut my own legs, but it was worth it as we broke free and kept traveling upward. "Noah!" Bethany's fingers closed around my ankle. "Cut them too." I only glanced behind me for a second, but in that glimpse, I saw Bethany reach out for me again, and miss, desperately trying to reach us even as her wrist flopped at her side and blood bloomed from her other hand. Her face was twisted in pain and fear. When the corpses realized that their intended prey was escaping their grasp, they instead moved to the easier prey. They needed someone to stay with them. All I heard was a gurgling scream slowly fading away behind me as I swam up. My brother and I burst from the surface of the lake. We were a good distance from shore, and it took some time for me to finally propel us onto it. The entire time we got lighter and lighter as we coughed out the lake. As soon as we touched the dirt, we crawled as far as we could manage before rolling onto our backs, gulping down the precious pine-scented air. The sight of the sunlight no longer filtered through cold water warmed my shivering body. I turned to look at Ken, who I could tell felt the same. He started to cry, and I hugged him. I patted his back to help him out as the remnants of the depths dribbled from his mouth. Flashbacks of when I burped him as a baby came to mind. That protective feeling of holding my newborn brother mirrored my current emotions as clearly as the reflections on the lake's surface. "Thank God! Thank God!" I said into his hair as I held him close. He started to try and speak. "I found your whistle. I know. You did good. I knew it was yours 'cause I broke it. Yeah, that's okay. I didn't want to be down there. I know. You're out now. You'll be okay. They didn't have Takis down there. I think it would have sucked." I laughed. "Yeah, buddy. You're right." All I told Uncle Chung-ho the next day was that I was bored of the job and needed something that paid. He grumbled about it, but I was let off the hook. Though he did ask me a few times if I knew where Bethany went. She wouldn't answer his calls. I told him I hadn't heard from her either. There was an investigation to find her, but nothing ever came up in the years that followed. Ken doesn't swim anymore, but besides that, he bounced back from what happened really well. He even started getting real good at biking. Resilience of youth, I guess. I'm in college now and decided to study in Korea. Stay with my mom and her family for a while. Even now I can feel the lake when I'm across the world. I can sense the eddies of the sand move in the ripples of water. I listen to the lapping against the shoreline. Bethany's laugh when she plays with her sister. Sometimes I can hear when Ken throws old toys into Lake Lullaby. He hopes it likes them,